So chapter 26 is on nutrition in animals. We're going to focus on the human digestive system. It's the first of the systems that we're going to talk about as we move through this second part of the course. The digestive system is the first of the systems that we're going to look at that key job is to exchange materials from the outside world to the inside environment of you. And so the digestive system is a really fairly fancy tube that runs all the way through you. And its really key job is to bring nutrients into your body and eliminate anything that's not used by the body. So your textbook loves to break things down. We're going to talk about how food is processed in 4 stages. We're going to talk about ingestion. That one's quite simple to conceptualize. Digestion, both mechanical and chemical. So understanding enzymes and chemical reactions are in that chemical digestion. Absorption, how the nutrients and materials get into you. And then the way out, the kind of the opposite to the ingestion, the elimination. There are a lot of great videos that I've linked to on the Moodle site, and I'd really encourage you to take a look at those. Crash Course does 2 different kind of versions of the digestive system. The first one is just the digestive system. It's an older video, and he talks with his mouth full quite a lot. The anatomy physiology series is really quite good. It goes into a little more detail, but knowing that the digestive system is probably something you already have some understanding and some familiarity with, the anatomy physiology ones might be really useful to you. So I'd encourage you to take a look at the videos that are posted on the Moodle site as sort of kind of material to supplement your understanding of this chapter 26. So as we talk about how our digestive system has 4 key steps, same as you are not a pigeon and you are not a pelican in all of the schematics in the publisher materials, you are also not a cat, but your textbook does talk about a variety of animals, not just humans. So obviously we're going to talk about this as human digestion, but it's a similar process as would be seen in any of your pets. And so ingestion, as the food goes into you. Digestion, both mechanical digestion in your mouth and in your stomach, and chemical digestion, understanding that process of hydrolysis where we break down large molecules into smaller molecules. And then we're going to talk about absorption. So this is where the nutrients enter your body, more so in your intestines, but also through other parts of your digestive system. And then the elimination of the undigested material. And so we're going to kind of go back to where we were once upon a time. You might remember this chart. Good old all of chapter 3 in one simple diagram here. So chapter 3 is where we talked about the different macromolecules. And really this arrow in between here is the digestion, right? That breaking things down, that hydrolysis to go from a polymer to the monomers, because these components are what we need to then build back up molecules in our body. And so there's this process of breaking down and absorbing so that our body can get what it needs as these raw materials. And as you can remember, proteins or polypeptides break down into amino acids. Carbohydrates are going to break down into monosaccharides. Nucleic acids can break down into their monomer, which are nucleotides, and fats can break down into their components. They were the only ones that were not a polymer, so they can break down into glycerol and fatty acids. And so, quick summary of this, hopefully it's review by this point and you've kind of internalized those molecules and the building blocks of life of those monomers or those components that your body's going to need. The human digestive system is basically one long tube. In the crash course video, the host Hank talks about us as being a really fancy donut which is super gross, but he's likening your digestive system to the hole in the donut because it really is a tube that runs all the way through you. And so that tube running all the way through you has a fancy name. It's called the alimentary canal. Certainly not a cruise you want to go on, but that's your the name of your digestive system's tube is the alimentary canal. So all of the organs that make up your digestive system are part of that alimentary canal. And you have also accessory glands that support your digestive system, that are part of your digestive system, that feed things into the alimentary canal at different points along. So the other key bits, we'll come back to this in a diagram on the next slide. The other thing that we could talk about as sort of like, some concepts or words to get started with this is that food moves through a lot of your alimentary canal in this wave of contraction and relaxation of smooth muscle. Remember, those are involuntary. Um, in this process called peristalsis. And peristalsis is really just a contraction and relaxation of the muscle tissues that propels the food through the tubes that make up your alimentary canal or make up your digestive system. You can see that in your esophagus. You can see that in your small intestine, your large intestine. That's the process that moves food through your digestive system. The other key thing that shows up a few places, and it seems like the digestive system is full of kind of trigger words that people don't like, and sphincters is one of those. So sphincters are basically the doorways in your digestive system. So they control the movement of food into and out of the different parts of your digestive system, or different parts or different digestive chambers. So as an example, your stomach has a sphincter at the top that would limit the upward movement of stomach acids. You don't want the stomach acids coming up into your esophagus. And it would also have a sphincter, controlling the food moving out of your stomach. So if you do have a leaky sphincter at the top of your stomach, that's when you feel heartburn. And I don't know if you've ever experienced heartburn. I'm not prone to it, I don't think, but I do remember one time when I was pregnant, thinking that I was potentially having a heart attack because it really hurts. Definitely led to a greater sense of sympathy in me for people who suffer from heartburn in a more chronic sense. But really, that's what's going on. And that gives you a bit of a connection to some of these words. So alimentary canal, peristalsis, and sphincter are the ones to get us going in the digestive system. If we were to take a look at your digestive system, and a lot of these pieces you already know as far as the anatomy goes, this tube running through is the alimentary canal. So everything running through that tube makes up the alimentary canal. And anything that's in green on this slide, the salivary glands, your gallbladder, liver, and pancreas, are the accessory glands. And those accessory glands secrete things to help the process of digestion. So when it comes all together, obviously your mouth and tongue and teeth are supported by your salivary glands. Food moves through your pharynx to your esophagus, that's your food tube, down into your stomach. The stomach then empties into the small intestine that is named for its diameter, not its length. It's very long. In the small intestine, you have these accessory glands of the gallbladder and the pancreas. The liver actually feeds into the gallbladder. But the gallbladder and the pancreas all come into the small intestine. Then we move into the large intestine, the rectum, and the anus. So a lot of these, parts of your digestive system you've done before. This is showing the sphincter at the top of your stomach and the sphincter at the bottom of your stomach as some examples of the sphincters, or little doorways in between the chambers or compartments of your digestive system. Digestion does involve begin in the mouth. Newsflash. In your mouth, you have a number of things going on. You have teeth that serve in the role of mechanical digestion, breaking the food up physically. You have saliva that moistens the food and makes it easier to swallow. In the saliva, there's a few key roles of saliva. Saliva contains enzymes. It contains an enzyme called salivary amylase. This is the first enzyme that is present in your digestive system. It's salivary because it's produced by the salivary glands, and it's in the saliva, and it's amylase because it breaks down amylose, which is a starch. And so the substrate for salivary amylase would be starch, or you could think of it as a carbohydrate. There is a correlation between the name of enzymes and the name of their substrate in that amylase breaks down amylose. Just like you might have heard of the enzyme lactase, breaking down the milk sugar lactose, same idea in that. So this is the beginning of chemical digestion. So in the mouth, we have both mechanical digestion and chemical digestion happening. Still talking about saliva and its role, it actually can buffer or neutralize acids. We're going to see that again in other parts of our digestive system where pH plays a role. And also saliva has antibacterial properties, and that antibacterial agents can kill some of the bacteria that may be ingested with the food. In addition to your teeth and saliva in your mouth, you also have your tongue, which is really important in tasting and shaping the bolus of food, the package of food, the mouthful, if you will, and moves the food towards the next part in the digestive tract, or the pharynx. So after swallowing, peristalsis is going to move the food through the esophagus to the stomach. So I left off on the last slide saying that we were in the pharynx. So the pharynx is that sort of top of your throat. Anyone getting a nasopharyngeal swab, which is the test for COVID-19, the pharynx is that back of your mouth or top of your throat. It branches off into your esophagus and your trachea. So esophagus is the food tube, and your trachea is your windpipe. So I put these words kind of all on one slide because it is important to keep them straight. The next system that we're going to talk about is the respiratory system. And so the trachea and the larynx are involved more in your respiratory system. And that's why I've put them in blue on this slide. It's just really a lot of words that sound quite similar. So pharynx and esophagus are what we're talking about with your digestive system. Larynx is your voice box, if you will, obviously not involved in digestion. So if we carry on from the pharynx to the esophagus, the little doorway that controls, which of the tubes your food is going down is your epiglottis. You also have a few other controls there, but basically that's the doorway that helps to control which tube things are going into. And so I think most of us have done that, taken a sip of a drink and somebody tells a really funny joke and you choke on it. You're coughing because that food has, kind of escaped the doorway of your epiglottis and it starts to go down the wrong tube. And so you do have two reflexes, that swallowing reflex, which is kind of enacted when food gets into the pharynx or at the top of the esophagus, and the coughing reflex. And that's to really clear anything that might be going down the wrong tube there. There's some images here to kind of take a look at what happens as you do swallow a bolus of food. And so you have this movement from your mouth into your esophagus. And here you can see that you have your epiglottis. And so the epiglottis default is up, allowing you to breathe as the default. If you were to swallow, the epiglottis moves down, blocking your larynx so the food can go into your esophagus. You also have an esophageal sphincter. Again, that idea that they are kind of the gatekeepers or doorways. So the epiglottis is that flap that controls which tube the food or air is going into. And here we have the esophageal sphincter that allows food to keeps air out of your stomach. If I said that right. Again, putting all of it together, that idea, we have the esophageal sphincter, we're moving towards the stomach through the action of peristalsis, so that wave-like action of the smooth muscle of your esophagus. We have a relaxation and a constriction that pushes it through. it's going to eventually reach your stomach. A fun thing to do if you happen to have a stethoscope, I often do it in in the like the lab or on campus, is to take a sip of water and listen for it to hit your stomach. It's not as instant as you might think. There's a little bit of a delay as the water moves through your esophagus and into your stomach. And if you haven't had too much to drink lately, you hear a bit of a sploosh. It's sort of fun to hear. So moving on into the stomach is a highly acidic environment. It's going to store the food for a short amount of time and start breaking it down. So we're talking about breaking it down both mechanically and chemically with acids and enzymes. So it's a highly muscular organ. It's really going to keep going with the mechanical breakdown as it grinds away um, because it is such a strong muscle. The other thing about it is that it's highly acidic, and so it has a pH of 2. If you remember the pH scale going from 0 to 14, that's highly acidic. It's highly acidic because there is a lot of hydrochloric acid in it. If you're not a chemistry person, it might be worth writing out this as hydrochloric acid. The hydrochloric acid comes from some cells called parietal cells. And the parietal cells secrete hydrogen ions and chloride ions, which combine to make HCl, as you can see. And that HCl is hydrochloric acid. That's what gives us the pH of 2. That acid does a few key things. It really kills anything that you may have eaten as far as bad stuff. So it kills the bacteria, and it's also corrosive in nature, and it starts to break apart cells and denature proteins in the food. We've talked about how proteins can be denatured, and pH was one of those things that denatured proteins. So here in the stomach, we have the corrosive effects of hydrochloric acid breaking apart cells and denaturing proteins. In addition to the acid breaking down the proteins, we also have another enzyme. So the enzyme that is present in the stomach is called pepsin. And pepsin comes about because of the hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen. So pepsinogen is a precursor to the enzyme pepsin. So enzyme, pepsin. Pepsin digests proteins. And so here we have this pepsin production is, a rarity in our bodies because it relies on positive feedback mechanisms. So the idea here is that when pepsin is produced, it activates more precursor production and therefore more pepsin. So you get this rapid sort of amplification of enzyme in your stomach. The acidic gastric juices mixed with the food and the contents of your stomach are now called another kind of trigger word, chyme. So chyme is that sort of nasty bit you've all probably been familiar with if you've ever had the stomach flu or ever, seen the contents of your stomach from throwing up. So anyway, that's what it's called. It's called chyme. We're going to just go back a wee bit here on that idea of what's happening in your stomach and specifically about that enzyme production. So the regulation of chemical digestion, and key what we're talking about here is pepsin, right? And pepsin works on proteins. The regulation of this or the beginning of it all, even though I said it's a positive feedback mechanism, it's controlled by hormones and nerve signals. So your stomach can start growling if you smell something good, so those would be nerve signals. Also hormones, and specifically gastrin is a hormone in your body. We don't do the endocrine system, so anytime there is a little bit about hormones, I try and kind of highlight a little bit. So gastrin's a hormone that's activated by the stretching of the stomach. And again, that's going to stimulate the secretion of the gastric juices, and the gastric juices contain that pepsinogen. So here we have the parietal cells. The parietal cells were the ones that produce the chloride ions and the hydrogen ions. We also have those chief cells. The chief cells, I don't think I said that in the first one. The chief cells are the precursor producer, that pepsinogen. And here we have positive feedback, illustrated by this number 3 arrow here, or 3 label, where we have the hydrochloric acid activating the pepsinogen and making the active enzyme pepsin. And the more pepsin we have, the more pepsinogen is going to be produced, with this idea that we get a rapid accumulation of the enzyme we need to break down proteins in our stomach. Most of the time, we understand our digestive system as many systems in our body. We learn a lot when things go wrong. So I've already talked about that idea of heartburn. But really, now that we've talked about the idea that the stomach is really acidic, that acid is super corrosive. And so what keeps the stomach acid from digesting your stomach itself is that the epithelial cells that make up your stomach also secrete mucus. And that mucus is actually there to protect the epithelial cells. And so we've got mitosis, recreating or renewing your epithelial cells. And we have the mucus lining that's protecting those epithelial cells. And so normally things are fine, everything works well. When things go wrong, that's when we're talking about, heartburn or GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. And like I said, until I experienced heartburn, and actually for a very limited amount of time, I don't think I fully understood just how horrible that affliction would be to have chronic heartburn. But that's really what we're talking about again with the acid in the stomach. The other thing in talking about the acid actually corroding um, or breaking down the stomach itself, would be about stomach acids. Ulcers, sorry, or gastric ulcers. So stomach ulcers, in back when I was a kid, were thought to be, increased, or the risk of stress was really important. So if you were really stressed, you'd develop stomach ulcers. Well, in your textbook, it does a really good job of talking about a scientist who investigated a hypothesis that it was actually a bacteria that was causing the ulcers to be produced. And so in your textbook, you can read about that. It's definitely something that has changed in our understanding over my lifetime. I know my sister and my dad both suffered from gastric ulcers or stomach ulcers. And again, kind of like that idea of heartburn, you don't really understand um, how important it is for things to go right until they've gone wrong. And so our understanding is a lot different about stomach acid, I keep saying stomach acid, stomach ulcers or gastric ulcers now, with this idea that they can be caused by a bacterial infection in the stomach. We're done with the stomach and moving on to the small intestine. So the small intestine's job is primarily for nutrient absorption. It's the major organ of chemical digestion and nutrient absorption. So we've got two things going on. I've already mentioned that the small intestine is named for its diameter, not its length. It's actually about 6 meters long, depending on how big a person you are. But regardless, even for a small person, that is a long tube. A few key things happen in the small intestine. So we had the acidic chyme being deposited into the small intestine from the stomach. And here we have one of our accessory organs, our pancreas, is going to secrete an alkaline pancreatic juice. The word alkaline means basic, in the case that basic things are, or bases are opposite to acids. And so if we have a base, or a basic pancreatic fluid, that's going to neutralize the acid chyme or the chyme from the stomach. And the other key thing that's going on here is that the pancreas is also going to secrete a whole lot of enzymes to chemically digest the food. And so there's a lot going on in the small intestine. From the pancreas, we have two things. We have the neutralization and we have a whole lot of enzymes. The other thing that happens in the small intestine is that we have another couple accessory organs here. We have the liver and the gallbladder being part of this secretion of bile. And so here we have bile as a secretion into the small intestine. And the key job of bile is that it's going to emulsify fat. Emulsify means break it up into tiny little bits. If you were to make a salad dressing, if you've ever made a salad dressing or homemade mayonnaise, you might add an egg as an emulsifier. A dish detergent emulsifies fat. It breaks it up, and so that it's more available to be attacked in the aqueous environment that your body is. And so just to recap here, bile is made in the liver and then sent to the gallbladder for storage. And then from the gallbladder, it's secreted into the small intestine to emulsify any of the fats that were in the chyme from the stomach. So lots going on. We're going to go back to the enzymes because they're really important. But just to recap here, neutralization of that alkaline pancreatic juice and the emulsification are processes, the emulsification was the bile, are key processes, but they are not the functions of enzymes. They help in our chemical digestion, but they're not actually chemical digestion in the sense of, an enzyme mediated reaction. This is a picture just showing how they're all coordinated. So the key thing here is that we're talking about the small intestine. The duodenum is the first part of your small intestine. It's divided into three different parts. The duodenum, the ileum, and the jejunum, which are a spelling test nightmare. You're not really required for those three different names, but this is the first part of the small intestine. So key things that are happening here. I talked about the pancreas. And we have the alkaline, meaning that it's a base or basic. Pancreatic juice is secreted, and that's going to do the key thing. I'm going to switch colors here of neutralizing or neutralizes the acid from the stomach. And the other key thing here is that we had this kind of chain of command. So the liver creates bile, and the gallbladder is going to store the bile and secrete it into the small intestine. The bile is an emulsifier. And so the key process here is emulsification of fats. So those are the two key processes that I said were not related to enzymes. The key thing that we're going to move on to now is that discussion of the enzymes that are also in the pancreatic juice. And so those enzymes are going to be key in the chemical digestion of the molecules in the contents of our small intestine. In your textbook, there is a bit of a summary of the different enzymes. Most of these ones are going to be from the pancreas. Let's go back to the beginning here because we've already talked about two different kinds of enzymes. So the first enzyme that we talked about was salivary amylase. It was produced in the mouth or salivary glands. We talked about it acting in the mouth. And what it acts on, remember, that's what substrate means. And so it acted on amylose, or as a general thing, a carbohydrate. Moving on out of the mouth, the next enzyme that we talked about was pepsin, and how pepsinogen, the precursor, was turned into pepsin in the presence of hydrochloric acid. It was produced in the stomach, and it acts in the stomach. And it acted on, or the substrate of pepsin was protein. So in the stomach, we had the stomach acid denaturing the protein, but we also had the enzyme pepsin breaking down proteins into their amino acids. The other ones here are sometimes named. So we have pancreatic amylase. So it's kind of a parallel to the, the salivary amylase in that it's produced in the pancreas. It acts in the small intestine. And its substrate is, again, amylose, or a starch, or a carbohydrate, if you will. The other ones here, and you can really simplify this, all of these are enzymes that are produced in the pancreas and are secreted in that pancreatic juice that's secreted into the small intestine. So they all act in the small intestine. And here we can see again some parallels between the naming of the enzymes and the substrate, or what they act on. So trypsin is similar to pepsin in the naming, and in that they both break down proteins. Lactase, maltase, sucrase, if you remember those, they are all breaking down carbohydrates or sugars. You could be specific in their substrates. So it would be lactose, maltose, and sucrose. But generally, they're all carbohydrates there. Nucleases, got to make sure we get all of our macromolecules, are going to break down nucleic acids into their nucleotides, their monomers, so those can be absorbed and reused by the body. And then lipases, they're going to break down lipids or fats. So we've gone through, a lot that's going on in the small intestine. We're going to talk about a little bit here, again, with the form and the function. So we've seen a picture similar to this, and we know that one of the key jobs, the key functions of our digestive system is absorption or exchange with the outside world. And so we've got a lot of surface area, which is the form that supports the function of absorption. And if we were to zoom in on the lining of the intestine here, we've got surface area being maximized by the folds of the intestinal lining, and then the extensions on them, the finger-like villi, even the microvilli here. All of that creating a ton of surface area, more cells being exposed to the contents of your small intestine, intestine for absorption. And the other thing, if we think about the cells that actually make up the epithelial tissue, they were the columnar. And so we have these columnar cells lining our intestine, and that puts a lot of cells in contact with the contents of our small intestine. The liver is key. We already talked about how the liver created bile and then sent that to the pancreas. The other thing about the liver is that a lot of the nutrients that are absorbed are sent directly to the liver. So the blood flows to the liver a lot from the small intestine, where the nutrients are processed and stored. And so we have this kind of dual involvement of the liver. So the blood from the digestive tract goes to the liver, and the liver is going to do some key functions. So it's going to take glucose and convert it to glycogen. Remember, glycogen was one of those polysaccharides that was for energy storage in animals. The other thing that the liver is going to do is make a bunch of proteins, including blood clotting proteins and lipoproteins that transport fats and cholesterol through the body. Liver also detoxifies things, making toxins less toxic. As an example, alcohol, it detoxifies. And we've already talked about how it produced the bile that then was stored in the or the pancreas and secreted into the small intestine. This is just showing that involvement of the liver and the connection between the liver and the digestive system. The hepatic portal vein, anything that has to do with your liver, and you could think the word hepatitis has to do with the liver. The last part of our kind of tour through the alimentary canal would be the large intestine, and the large intestine's key job is to really reclaim the water that's in the contents of the intestines. We obviously know that there's two sort of ends of the spectrum here, so you don't want too much water left in, you don't want too much water taken out of the contents of your intestine. Your feces, whatever is left over, is going to be stored in your rectum, and then it'll be excreted. Key things that happen in your large intestine would be the bacteria flora. So we talk about how important this is, and I really do think that this is probably one of those key things that we'll understand more and more about in human health and wellness. And so you are actually benefiting from the bacteria that are living in your intestines because the bacteria are producing vitamins. So the metabolism of these other little microbes, when they die, your body then can absorb the things that they have made. So some of the vitamins like vitamin K and vitamin and B vitamins come because of the microflora or the bacteria that populate your intestines. Your appendix is located at the junction of the small intestine and the large intestine sometimes called the colon. It makes a minor contribution to immunity, apparently. I'm definitely a test case for this. I am the experimental group because I do not have an appendix. So the idea used to be that it was just a vestigial structure, a holdover from a previous version of a digestive system. But really, maybe it does have a bit of a starter kit. So it's a microbial starter potentially for that bacteria, that microflora that's important for your health and wellness, the microbes that live in your intestines.